You're watching the Merged Marketing Podcast. You're listening to the Merged Marketing Podcast, and this is episode 139. And right there with me today is Prarthana Sibal, and we're talking about how to create category-leading corporate podcasts. Welcome to the show.
Great to be here, Jet. Really, really great to be here. Mhm.
Awesome. And Prarthana is coming to us all the way from Singapore today. So appreciate her being flexible with the time difference today. So we'll kind of get right to the nuts and bolts of this episode so Prarthana can settle down and go to sleep. So first and foremost, Prarthana, maybe tell us a little bit about your journey in becoming the head of client services at Pikal.
Yeah, absolutely. My background is actually in marketing. So I did my master's in that. And while I was doing my master's, obviously they do recommend you to do some internships and even try out some different, startups and industries that otherwise are not very traditional. And that is where I got an opportunity to start working with Pickle and Co. Now, the good part was that I was starting out my first job or internship, and the company was starting out as well. So it was a great chance for me to grow along with the company as it was growing. And that's when we figured out the business model together with the core team. We started reaching out to the clients, and I'm very happy to say that I was part of the team who helped get the first dollar in for the company. And we've been going strong for the last 4 years, and we work with some top amazing brands. Mhm.
That's amazing. And what do you find are the brands that you're mostly working with? Would it be entrepreneurs
Mhm.
looking to start a podcast, e-commerce business owners? Like what is that demographic? What industry are they
Yeah.
in and what do they look like?
Yeah, just the kind of people that we work with are mainly corporates ranging from, let's say, management consultancies to banking, fintech space. Along with that, even some of the education firms and government organizations as well. Now, these brands, some of them are great at their branding and thought leadership and so on. But if you see, these brands are very traditional and not sexy brands like a SaaS platform or SaaS companies, right? So that is why it is more needed for these brands to be authentic and share their content beyond the usual, white papers and the .com and the social promotion and so on. And that's where they start with the idea of a B2B podcast.
So I think that's a really good question because, for a lot of our audience who are entrepreneurs and small business owners, they've been playing or toying with the idea of starting their own podcast. But
Mhm.
what's the best way someone or a business owner can come up with that idea for the podcast?
Mhm. Jay, before you start a podcast, people actually start focusing a lot on their equipment and the production process and so on, but they forget about the main thing, which is about the planning side of the podcast. We actually give quite a lot of focus on the planning, where we focus on what is the main reason you want to start a podcast. So, an alignment session like that to align your business objectives along with your podcast objectives, because you are a podcast host, Jay, and you'll know that there's always a tendency of a pod fade, where after 6 episodes you'll think of, wait, why did I start my podcast in the first place, right? So to avoid this pod fade and to make sure that you're having a very successful and a sustainable podcast going, you need to have that kind of an influence of the podcast on your business metrics as well, and it should be able to move the needle within the business. So within the planning phase, if you're looking at it, you need to be very clear. Are you starting your podcast for acquisition purposes? Like you want to get leads out of it? Or are you starting your podcast for influence purposes, more of a thought leadership piece and influencing your network and community? So, based on that, your content, your format, your podcast design, and everything will I would say get customized, and accordingly then we can get into, let's say, the content, we can get into the production and promotion and so on.
Let's break that down for a second, Prathana, because you talked about two separate types of directions with your podcast or purposes for
Mhm,
your podcast, and one's to generate leads, and the other is
mhm.
to create influence. What is the big difference between those two when it comes to coming up with the podcast plan?
Yeah, absolutely. So with the B2B podcast, main purpose for that to actually run is going to be for influence purpose. But if you're looking for a podcast more for a lead acquisition purpose, it has to be speaking to the mass, and it is should be a B2C podcast, which is business to consumer podcast. The difference is how you measure the success of this podcast as well. For a B2B podcast, because you just want to focus on your existing audience and even the audience that is growing, you would not want, let's say, 10,000 to 100,000 downloads for your podcast, right? You just would want to focus on your engagement percentage, that how many people are actually listening your podcast till the end, right? So are you really influencing and engaging your existing audience? It might be smaller number, right? But when you're talking about lead acquisition, it is all about your call to actions. It is all about where are you taking where is the podcast sitting within your funnel, and also how to grow your audience further and further so that you can get better leads and better numbers within your funnel. So for that, the metric is going to be your listeners, subscribers, downloads. That's going to be your top metric.
So that's interesting because I think that's something that's overlooked by a lot of podcasters are the
Mm-hmm,
metrics, right?
mm-hmm,
And for our agency, we're a B2B podcast, geared towards entrepreneurs, business owners, marketing people. And for us, it is leads. But it
mm-hmm,
really is it is kind of challenging to track that because I'll have conversations with people and they'll become a client of Merged Media. And 6 months down the road, I'll find out that they've actually been listening to my podcast for a
mm-hmm.
year. So,
Yeah.
are there some ways to better attribute leads that come through a podcast funnel?
Yeah, so for that, Jay, where you need to start is with an omni-channel approach towards podcast. If you are seeing podcast as just a standalone one of the channels that you do, just like your .com, then that is not the correct way. You need to see podcast sitting across all your channels such that by the end of it you are getting the audio that goes out on all the podcast platforms like Apple, Spotify, Google Podcast, and so on. Along with that, let's say the full transcript goes on your .com, such that it is great for SEO purposes, great for discovery. And as you said, the person was listening to your podcast for last 1 year, right? They can discover your content further as they search for the keywords. Then the third channel should be the socials, where the highlights and the snippets and the quote cards and all of that material goes on social. So attributing podcast just doesn't mean looking at your downloads or listeners or subscribers. You need to see what kind of engagement are these content derivatives that are coming from podcast giving you. So how many people are actually going to your podcast page and listening to it there, or discovering through Google, or even looking at how people are really reacting to your different posts that are going out on social channels. So across all these channels, if you are able to get the metrics together, that is the dashboard you should be looking at for your podcast success.
For the Merge Marketing Podcast, we tick off almost all of the boxes of what you just
Mhm,
said, except for transcription. So for our
mhm,
episode on our website, we'll have a description, but we won't
mhm,
have the transcription, which is very interesting because you're absolutely right. There's some SEO benefits to having that transcription on the site. Now, when we talk about doing the transcription, is how does that work? Do you just grab it verbatim from the transcript and put it onto the web page, or are you editing that? Because I'm sure there's a lot of
mhm.
edits that are required, even SEO
Yeah.
optimizing that content.
Yeah, absolutely. So when we are having a conversation, there are a lot of filler words like, yeah, and so on. But if you're talking about creating a very professional article or blog post out of it, there will be some extra work that we do put in. So we have editors in the team who help just because, as I said, we work with the corporate. So we need to make sure that we have it as slick as possible for it to go out on their .com.
So, what are some of the big challenges that are facing podcasters and aspiring podcasters in 2022?
Yeah. So one of the big ones is, Jay, that because actually people thought that because of COVID, because of the commute time going down, people are actually not be listening to a lot of podcasts, but it has totally been the other way, right? We've seen a great increase in the podcast content getting released, plus a great increase in even podcast listeners. And that is because people do have the video fatigue, the webinar fatigue, and so on, and they just want to get that knowledge sharing content pieces through audio, or while they're doing some other task, and so on. So we have seen a lot of increase, and that has also motivated more people and more entrepreneurs, more corporates to start the podcast. The other reason why they are starting podcasts is seeing their competitors, right? So that bank or these competitor banks have a podcast, why not us, right? That's the last piece left, so might as well start that. So that's the motivation to get started with. But when they have started, the motivation is kept up based on the metrics, right? So if they are able to have the performance reports all together, they are able to see the results. That is the motivation for them to keep on going for the podcast, even after, let's say, sometime kind of an MVP with their podcast. But one of the challenge that they still face is it's the promotion side. So how can they align all their channels? Because when we work with corporates, they have a lot of moving parts, and that's where we come in. So we work with them to create a promotion flywheel where all these different channels merge together.
I'm so happy to hear that you're seeing it firsthand because you work
Mhm.
exclusively with podcasts. That there is an uptick in the amount of listeners, and I think
Mhm.
that is so true. I mean, myself included. I like to multitask, and it's tough to multitask when you're trying to consume video content and do something else at
Mhm.
the same time. But when you have a podcast, you can go out for a run, you can be in the car on your
Yeah.
commute, and or
Mhm.
you can even sit here and work and have a podcast going in the background, right? So I think there's that multitask element which a lot of people are probably leveraging more and more since the pandemic, right? Is taking
Mhm.
advantage and trying to soak up as much education as possible, which has been a huge trend during the pandemic. So just to go over to what we talked about in terms of the challenges. And I think for a podcaster specifically, one of the big challenges is you get so excited to start a podcast and you
Mhm.
launch the podcast with about 5 episodes, and maybe you don't get the amount of downloads or subscribers or
Yeah.
listens that you want, and it falls flat. And there you go. Your podcast is a total of 5 episodes, and it sits there in the podcast graveyard with all of the other podcasts out there.
Mhm.
What kind of advice do you give to those podcasters that might have given up too soon?
Yeah, Jay. So reason why you should be starting your podcast is not for the downloads, but the other kind of content that it can provide you for your personal branding. So, Jay, as you mentioned, there will be like all this content will also be going out on Facebook, LinkedIn, and all the highlights. So see it as a package rather than I'm not getting enough downloads or so on. The other thing is that it needs to be done consistently before people start discovering your content. So your podcast SEO or Apple Podcast promoting your podcast further, that's going to happen only when you are regular with your content. The content is consistently going out. If you're really releasing an episode, let's say once a month, and then after 3 months later you're releasing another episode, firstly you have lost that initial listeners, their attention span, right? So anyways, it is too less. So for that purpose, you need to be consistently pushing out content, and you have to, when you're getting into it, the commitment is long term for sure. Rather than if you want to get short term results, might as well do webinars, or might as well do some Facebook ads, or might as well do some videos, and done and dusted, right? You'll get a lot of views there, but you won't get that kind of an engagement that you can get with a podcast.
I've said it before and I'll say it again. The hardest part of doing a podcast is the consistency and
Yeah.
remaining consistent. There have been times where I've literally had to call in favors to friends to be a podcast guest on my
Hmm.
show because I
Hmm.
wanted to stay consistent every single week since February 2020. And we have been. But since those times where I've been panicking to find a guest, I've actually bumped ahead so much that we're about 8 to 10 episodes ahead now,
Yeah.
which gives us that buffer. So if somebody happens to cancel in a given week, it's okay. It's no
Hmm.
problem. So I think it's always good for all podcasters out there to have that sort of a buffer in case things don't go as planned, and you can still remain
Yeah.
consistent for your audience.
Absolutely, Jay. And then, especially if you're working with busy schedules, you're working across time zones. Uh, we have like a 12-hour difference between our time right now. So with that, what helps is having a separate recording schedule and having a separate publishing schedule. So rather than focusing on, okay, this next episode needs to go out, so I'll record a week before, rather than that, do batch recordings. And once you've done the batch recordings, you'll be more comfortable and focusing on, you'll be able to focus more on your creative juices there, rather than focusing on, okay, where should I hustle to get the next guest from. So it's that's the kind of a sweet spot that you can achieve with your podcast. But again, it requires time, it requires your efforts, it requires a team, and that's where my team also and our company also comes in, just to do that heavy lifting, so that you can work with your guest and your content where you are best at.
I love what you said about batching. That's a key word.
Hmm.
It's batching those episodes. We had John Lee Dumas on the podcast a while back, who is
Hmm.
he does Entrepreneurs on Fire. He's
Yeah.
recorded thousands and thousands and thousands of episodes. He literally does all of his recordings in basically one day in
Hmm.
little, 20-minute chunks. And he does it his entire month in basically one day. And then he
Hmm.
doesn't have to think about the podcast for the rest of the month. And it's good because you get in that state of mind where it's just like podcast, podcast, podcast. For me, the way I do it is my Tuesdays are podcast days.
Hmm.
Typically, I'll do my recording, I'll go on other podcasts only on Tuesdays. So when I wake up in the morning, I know today is my podcast day,
Hmm.
and it just makes your state of mind that much better when you know what you're tackling in that day is just podcasts and nothing else. So
Hmm.
yeah. So I mean, I want to go now, Prarthana, to the nuts and bolts of this episode, which is how to create those category leading corporate podcasts. So maybe you can share some of those tricks or some of those big needle movers in terms of getting that
Hmm.
podcast to become a category leading podcast.
Yeah. So for this, there are a couple of things here that you can definitely do off the bat. So when you're saying category leading, firstly, you should know which category are you playing in. And I'm talking about the different categories that are given by Apple Podcast. So your primary category, as an example, is business. But what is your secondary category? Are you in entrepreneurship? Are you in management? Are you in investing, or so on? If you are in the right category, you will have more potential to go up your ranking for different stores or different regions, and that will help you to get more of the organic audience. Because we can't disagree that Apple Podcast already has a huge listenership and very engaged podcast listeners, right? So Apple is going to promote you further if they think that the content is more aligned with the kind of listeners that they have on their platform. Now for that, you, as I said, content is definitely the key. Rather than focusing on what do you want to share, see what are the things that the listeners want to listen to. Do they want you to talk about digital transformation in banking space, or do they want you to talk about the how to within creating a digital retail bank, right? So there can be a lot of such content pieces, and that's why it's very important for you to focus on your content. That don't focus about what you want to push out to the listeners. Think about what they would like or how they would benefit it. So when we are thinking about the content, Jay, we always start of thinking of we create an audience avatar and we look at, okay, what are their pain points and how can these episodes solve those pain points. And some of the episodes might be talking about the pain points, and you have some experts sharing the knowledge. But at the same time, you can also do a bit of a mix up with the content, so even sharing some live examples through your case studies or clients joining in the podcast, so that people don't see this content only as academic, but also as someone who has practiced this content in real life within their organization and so on. So your content is definitely more aligned, your content is more relevant, your content is more people will be subscribing to your podcast and coming back to you. And thus, more subscribers definitely mean that you will be going up your category ranking on Apple Podcast. The other thing is, don't forget about the power of reviews and ratings on Apple Podcast. We do see like the podcasts which are in top 10, they have about 1500 to 2000 reviews and ratings, and there is a reason for that. Again, that's the sign, and how Apple Podcast algorithm works, that is a sign to them that people are really enjoying your content. And therefore promotes it further. So reviews and ratings definitely keep it as part of your mix or as a mix of your call to action. So these two things are good to get started with. The other things of obviously to look at category leading podcast is like getting a celebrity guest as an example as a mix once in a while. uh, it might not they might not promote on their channels because they are a celebrity guest, but what you can get is that immediate that that break of getting a huge audience immediately just because of leveraging them. At the same time, keep a mix of thought leaders, and if you have the content, you have the review and ratings, and you have your guests sorted, I think that will help you reach a category leading podcast.
100%. And, even selfishly, I, on my podcast, I have guests on here talking about things that I want to learn more about. So there's a good chance
Mhm.
your audience, you can really embrace that if your audience has that same sort of, thought process or like-minded to yourself. Have
Mhm.
those type of guests on that you want to interview, because there's a good chance your audience is going to get that same value that you get from that
Yeah.
conversation. Prarthana, is there any benefit to SEO optimized titles for episodes? Is SEO a play when it comes to Apple Podcasts?
Absolutely, Jay. That's a very good point because, firstly, when you're talking about your podcast title, that is the top SEO that you can, or it gets the most weightage when it comes to Apple Podcasts. So always make sure that you have at least one or two keywords that you would like people to search you with. So on Apple Podcasts, it's not like I'm going to search. Put the entire podcast title and then go and search for that podcast. Let's say, as an example, if I'm interested in a marketing podcast, I'm just going to search for marketing, or I'm just going to search for banking, right? So it's very necessary to put these keywords like banking, or as an example, even for your podcast, right? You've got the keyword right there. So in the podcast title, maximum weightage, but not to forget about the episode title and the description as well. There are people who and we have done our own set of A/B testing on this as well. There are people who might put in a big fancy episode title, but not really sharing exactly what people what is going to be shared in the episode. So rather than that, focus on the SEO again, so that your content is discoverable not just when you promote it, but even few months or years down the line, right? Put in the keywords like mental health, climate change, ESG, and so on, if that is what the content is about. And the description, don't shy away from having a long description. Put in the timestamps, put in the links. Um, like Apple Podcasts and Spotify as well, they support all of these things. So don't shy away from that.
Thank you so much, Prarthana. If our audience has any questions for you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Yeah, so Jeb, they can reach out to me via LinkedIn. So my name is Prarthana Sibal. So you can reach out to me there. Or if you want to have a chat with me as well as my team, you can reach out to us via our contact form on the website. So it is pittal.com, pittal.com.
Awesome. Prarthana, we end every episode with the same question. That question's this: if you can choose one person, dead or alive, to represent your brand, who would it be and why?
Oh, this is a great one. So I am with this. Oh, this is a really tough one, Jay. I wish you would have given it to me earlier.
No, it wouldn't be as
uh,
fun. I got to catch you off guard with these, right?
yeah, so our brand is all about authenticity. It's all about leadership. It's all about unlocking the value and talking openly about what are the big problems. So I would say someone like Bill Gates would be great to represent the brand, because he is not he doesn't shy away from talking about the big challenges that are happening, what are the big things that are happening in the world, not just within his industry but otherwise as well. And that is what we are all about: authentic leadership at scale.
Chalk one up for Bill Gates. There we go. Prarthana, thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll see you soon.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. Thanks for having me.